Hello, hello, welcome. I'm Whitney Kobrin, and today with me I have a special guest, Coach Keeg. And today we are going to be talking about evolving yourself and what it takes to make that journey within. So I'm super excited. Keegan, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Awesome. So I'd love to just start with, I know that you are in the process of writing a book, and your book is sort of centered around these five pillars. And with these five pillars, they are what is within us, the areas that we want to focus on evolving. So tell me a little bit about how you came up with this and what these pillars are.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So, as you mentioned, the premise is built around the five pillars. The first one is our body, which is really the first authority that we have over an entity, the first relationship that we have. We start to move our fingers and toes and use this to gain sustenance. The second is the mind, and really the prefrontal cortex has to develop. So, it takes a little bit of time before we have that memory, before we have the cognitive function. And then the third is the heart, which is the relationships. But when we first start with our parents, we're really just relying on them for sustenance again. We don't have the ability to create those relationships until a little bit later in life. So those three pillars are really our internal life, our internal world. When we get to the fourth pillar, that's your spirit, your spirituality. And this is more about the existential questions, the external world. So once you can understand those four pillars and those areas of your life, you can start to develop your purpose, which ultimately is a legacy, a service, a reason for being. So this is just an incredible journey, and I love the concept. I believe that everybody has the abilities, the skills, the experiences within them already. It's just about bringing them to light and using those to serve other people.
Wow, that's awesome. I love that. And it's interesting because I work as a love coach. And so I'm mostly helping people the way that they see it is I'm helping them with their heart, with their relationships. But I actually do touch upon all five of these pillars. And it's just necessary, right? Do you find that you can uh, work on evolving one and not the other, or that some people are really overly developed in some areas but not in others, or do you find that they're more equal across the board?
Whitney, that's a great question. I find that most people are usually really strong in one of these pillars. They may be really good with their routine and their regimen for their health. They eat healthy, they have an exercise, they sleep well, they drink an appropriate amount of water, but they may not be as clear on their mindset, and they may need some work or development there. And that can be true with different pillars and different parameters. It's rare that you'll find somebody that's firing on all levels for all five. And the reason for that is because part of the humanity, part of what sets us apart from the animal kingdom is we have this amazing power of choice. And with that power of choice, we are always growing and evolving. So I meet people sometimes that say, oh, I don't need help. I've already made it. But if you feel that way, then you've already lost. And I don't mean that in a degrading manner. It's more the fact that part of this journey, part of life is discovering these things. And you really need to expand on all of them as you progress forward.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm just thinking about like how hard life is for so many people and what a struggle it is, um, with depression, with being overweight and getting health problems and diabetes and just being disconnected spiritually, being blocked. Our society is in a rough spot right now with the stress that we have. I feel like we live in this overly stressed out world now where we're just pulled in so many different directions. And I think what we've gone through with this pandemic and closing everything down and being stuck at home, it was sort of like the bubble bursts. Like we can only burn ourselves out so much for so long. And I think that as horrible and awful as this pandemic experience has been, if anyone were to look for a silver lining, I think it was this peace, this less on the schedule, not being torn in so many directions and having some forms of stress taken away. Although I know that there's been other forms of stress that have been added by that. But just thinking about being at home with our families, coming back to the basics, right, has been impactful.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think when we look at the stats from last year, from 2020, it's a little bit scary to learn that nearly 600,000 people just in the US took their lives. So based on what you were saying with the stress and depression and anxiety being at an all-time high, I mean, that's almost 5% of our population. So that's a staggering number. And I think that one of the really powerful tools, and I touch on this in the book, but I love this concept, is what questions are you asking yourself? Are you asking yourself empowering questions or disempowering questions? There's a quote that everybody hears and they throw it around, but life is 10% what happens to you, 90% how you respond. So I found that there are 3 really empowering questions that we can ask ourselves. One of those is, what can I learn from this? Number 2 is, what is the opportunity here? And number 3 is, how can I use this to change the life or lives of other people? Wow. I think Gary Vaynerchuk said it really well. And he basically said that when you have a conversation with somebody, the way that they view the world is the quickest telltale sign to their results. If you go into COVID, for example, and you think about the negatives and the restraints, then you're going to get those results. You're going to manifest and magnetize those negative results towards you. But if you can look at the opportunity and say, wow, I have this opportunity to spend more time with my family, to spend more time with my animals. How many people got dogs that normally wouldn't because they have that time there? People are starting businesses. There's so much beauty in this right now, and there is an opportunity. So it's about understanding what that is and asking those empowering questions.
Yeah, I love that. And, in this human life, there is suffering. No one is immune from it. And I know that I've been through, my husband passed away about 4 years ago. And it was just out of the blue, unexpected. He was young, and it was the absolute worst thing that could happen. And it was difficult to have faith during that process. But I remember just thinking, what are my choices? Stay stuck. And of course, I did have to go through the grieving process. But after months, after years, how long do you stay in that? How long do you stay stuck? And I just made a choice that I was going to be the best version of myself that I could be coming out of this tragedy, to use the pain that I went through to help other people and to grow myself and to grow spiritually, because I think I was one of those people that was strong in body, strong in mind, strong in heart, but lacking the spirit and purpose. And I bet there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way. And through this unexpected tragedy and just the worst thing that I could imagine happening, it's weird how these things work out, but I found a spiritual path. And for me, it wasn't about religion. It was about coming back to my energetic body and nature and having faith in a higher power, being able to surrender. People say, Jesus, take the wheel. And for me, it's just, letting go of the expected outcome sometimes, letting go of having to control everything, letting go of making things happen and forcing things and trying to fit square pegs into round holes. Sometimes it's more powerful to not force things. Sometimes it's more powerful to let go. And through that process that I went through of grieving and having the low lows and not resisting it, but letting that sadness and depression really express itself, and then also having highs of, you know, good times and good moments and growth, and allowing all of that to exist in one, it helped me to find my spirit, and it also helped me to find my purpose. I wouldn't be here as a coach helping women to love themselves, helping women to also go through this journey, you know, evolving themselves, the journey within. That's our topic today. Evolve yourself, the journey within. And the more we do evolve ourselves, the more we can evolve other people as well and lift other people up and help them. I mean, it's crazy how all of this fits so tightly into your, you know, your structure here, that I went through those specific steps and found my purpose. And you know, then you kind of go back and it's like spinning plates, right? It's like, okay, spin this one, spin this one. Oh, this one's getting low. Oh, the body, the health is starting to need some attention now. All right. Did you have
Yeah,
I'd love to hear more about your story and, you know, what brought you to being a coach? Because I imagine it wasn't all, you know, straight line uphill, happy go lucky.
no, absolutely not. And I first want to say thank you for sharing. I know that there's a vulnerability in expressing our pain points. So that just shows a lot of character on your behalf. And I think that's incredible. I'll share a little bit about my story, but before I get into that, I think there are three really, really big points that you had shared. Number one is the decision-making process. We are always making a decision. You either make a decision to stop doing one thing or start doing another. To decide not to make a decision is making a decision. So it usually starts there. You've got to make the decision to accept or defeat what is hindering you. The next point is the pain. And that's something that you mentioned. And oftentimes there's a negative connotation with pain because our brains are wired to avoid pain. But what I've found is that pain is the number one catalyst for change. Oftentimes, people will not share any change whatsoever until they've experienced immense amount of pain, and they don't want to get those results ever again. I think about the story. There's an individual, and the father is an alcoholic, and he grows up and he abuses the kids and his wife, and he's a drunk, and he's got two sons. And one son grows up and becomes an alcoholic, and he doesn't have a family, and he's kind of a recluse. And the other son ends up never drinking a day in his life and becomes extremely successful. And when both of them were asked, how did you get to this point? They had the exact same response: because my dad was an alcoholic. But it was about the differentiation and the decision that they made and the path that they chose to get a different result. And then the third thing that you had mentioned is that spiritual quest. And oftentimes what I have found is that people usually avoid that conversation. I work with a company that's a global company. And what I've learned is that it's a world understanding that there are two things you don't really talk about in public, and that's religion and politics. So when we think about spirituality, oftentimes people are turned off by it because they immediately think religion. But the truth is, it's a much deeper quest than that. And really the root of spirituality is the fear of death. And Freud said this really well. And what he said was that over the existence of humanity, there's always going to be this contemplative piece of what separates us from animals and gods, and finding that in between, that balance, and coming up with your own solution. So that's a really interesting take, analyzing the existential questions. What is time? What is money? What is matter? What does my existence mean? You know, these are really powerful things. So I just wanted to touch base on those really quickly because I thought that was really powerful in what you shared. And back to your point again, Whitney, in my story, it came through pain as well. I wouldn't be where I was today if I hadn't experienced an immense amount of pain. And the short and sweet version is abuse, addictions, abandonment. Those are the three big words that really stand out for me without getting too graphic. But I think that some of those experience, there's another really powerful quote is the depth of your pain produces the height of your success. In other words, when you experience a ton of pain, your ability to endure more and more pain and achieve that success is heightened. So ultimately, pain is it's a catalyst, but it's also a prerequisite. When you look at the fact that over 87% of the world's millionaires and billionaires are self-made, you think they just were handed that? Of course not. People talk about, oh, you're lucky, this and that. No, it's about enduring that pain, finding that purpose, and coming out on top to serve other people.
Yeah, amazing. And I noticed that you touched on this fear of death. And I know we've talked in the past about fear. And one thing that I've learned and that I coach people around is that if you're not conscious about it, fear will run your life. And I do an exercise where I help people to discover all of these different fears. And the way that it works is they'll always come up with 2 or 3 right off the bat. They're like, oh, I'm afraid of heights, or I'm afraid of snakes, or I'm afraid of death, and what happens is they're like, I don't know what else. And I'll push and I'll pull and I'll figure it out. And all of a sudden they realize I'm afraid of ending up in a relationship like my parents. And they're like, oh, now I know how fear is running my life, and I'm pushing everyone away because I'm afraid of that. And, we are programmed to have fear in nature and as babies from a very young age, we learn what fear is. We learn what fear is because we have to protect ourselves from the wild animals, from falling off a cliff, from all of these dangers in life. And unfortunately, we as modern humans allow ourselves to be conditioned and programmed by this fear. And it really does run our life. I mean, I can give you a very basic example, and then because a lot of times these more complex examples, people don't understand. Like if you're afraid of being alone, you're going to hang on to toxic relationships for way longer than you should. And that's fear running your life. You're afraid to be alone. You're afraid to start over. You're afraid to go out and date. You're afraid of what is unknown. We're afraid of the unknown, even though something better is also out in the unknown. So if someone's afraid of heights and they're afraid of going over a highway overpass or going over a bridge, it's very easy to see how that might run your life. If you can't cross the bridge, you can't go to certain places. You can't see certain people. If you can't go over a highway overpass, you might have to go the long way and the slow way. And a lot of people, I mean, I'd say probably almost 100%. How many people do you know don't let fear run their life?
Wow, very powerful points. I think, again, I've got three bases to go on. And I think that what you mentioned is absolutely critical from a coaching capacity: fear. If we look at the obstacles that are preventing us from achieving our goals, our destiny, it is always getting to the root of those hindrances. And the root of that is fear. I've broken this down into 6 human fears. And I think that even if you name 100 different fears, they're going to fall into one of those 6 categories. So getting to the actual root, just like you said, Whitney, that's the most pivotal point. You've got to understand what is the origin of this. And then the second point is rewiring. Once you understand the root of those fears, you have to understand that neurologically you have wired a response or an affiliation or an emotional elicit, whatever that is. You have this wired programming in your mind. So you've got to find ways to go to what's called the reticular activating system, which is about a 2-inch strand in the back of your spine And all that does is interprets your sight, your sound, and your touch. So if you can analyze what I am predominantly basing those fear responses off, sight, sound, or touch, now I can use that and rewire some of those processes to get a different result, which is really, really powerful. And the third thing is, just like you had said, bridging the gap. You use the overpass. That's a great example. What I have found is that usually if we use that same example, somebody will start on one side of the bridge, and on the opposing side of the bridge is what they desire. It's the outcome. The reality is where you start, you already have everything inside of you. You've got the tools, you have the abilities, you have everything that you could possibly need to bridge that gap from one side to the next. But sometimes we need a little bit of help. And people think, especially in our society today, that asking for help is a sign of weakness, but the contrary couldn't be more true. It's really a sign of strength. It shows strength. And we think about people like Michael Phelps, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Serena Williams. These are all people that have coaches outside of their profession. They've got life coaches or empowerment coaches that help them get to the next level. And there are obviously many other forms. You could get a mentor, a role model of some fashion, but it's always really powerful to get somebody that's non-biased to come and help guide you. And the best reason for a role model, it saves time. You know, you can bypass the failures and just get right to the point and make it your own. So that's what I had based on what you said. I thought those were incredible points though.
Yeah. And so for people who are watching, who are thinking, wait, what am I leading with fear? Is fear running my life? And they start thinking about what fears they have. You gave some awesome tips for overcoming fear. You know, there's something that they call systematic desensitization to overcome phobias. So if somebody's has a phobia, which is an extreme fear that really affects your whole nervous system, it affects your brain, it affects your body. When someone has a phobia of, say, spiders, one of the ways that they get through this is this systematic desensitization. So they wouldn't just throw you in a pit of spiders and be like, get over it, right? They would maybe show you a picture of a spider first and let you kind of get used to the picture of the spider. And then the next day, maybe have one somewhere in the next room and deal with that. And then the next day, maybe show you one in a box. And then little by little, we can retrain ourselves and reprogram our brain, because our brains, you know, we used to think that we only had so many brain cells and once they're gone, they're gone. But now, since around the 80s, we've known that this is not true, that the brain is an electrical map that has different pathways and highways and neurons and synapses, and the way that we operate on a regular basis, those become the most used paths and they become sort of wired that way. But it is possible at almost any age to reprogram the brain, to create new pathways. And so I just want to give practical advice that we can give to people who are like, wait, that's me. What can I do about this? So systematic desensitization is one way, you know, just little by little kind of force yourself to overcome it and get out of it. I had a client tell me the other day, the overpass example actually comes from her. She was afraid of them and she told me how she overcame it. And what she said was, well, I had faith and courage. And that was all she needed to overcome this. And I was like, wow, that is really powerful, because anybody could overcome any fear almost if they just have enough faith to trust that this fear is not going to overtake them. It's not going to kill them. It's not the only option. And courage. And there's this awesome quote by Brené Brown, who I love, who wrote The Gifts of Imperfection and many other books about vulnerability. But she has this quote that courage is a heart word. The root of the word courage, cor, is the Latin word for heart. And in one of the earliest forms, hold on a second, I almost lost it. The word courage meant to speak one's mind by telling all one's heart. Over time, this definition has changed, and today we typically associate courage with heroic and brave deeds. But in my opinion, this definition fails to recognize the inner strength and level of commitment required for us to actually speak honestly and openly about who we are and about our experiences, good and bad. Speaking from our hearts is what I think of as ordinary courage.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
I love that. I think that we need courage. You know, courage is not the absence of fear, it's having the fear and doing the thing anyway. And what helps is this faith, having faith that things have a way of working out, that as bad as the situation is now, it doesn't have to stay that way forever. And the more that we have a positive outlook and a positive expectation, the more likely that is to come about. So are there any other tips that you have around overcoming fear, or just understanding our fear or recognizing it and how it's controlling us?
Absolutely. So I think when we look at fear, some of the indicators that you're living in fear are worry, doubt, anxiety, depression, and fear itself. Those are the roots of fear. I work with a global company called Pathway with Stuttering. And what I found is this is a community of people that stutter, stammer, or have speech impediment. I had a speech impediment when I was a child. So this is very near and dear to my heart. At that point in time, referencing back to those 6 human fears, I lived in the fear of criticism. Now, in the midst, I could not identify that because I just thought, oh, I don't want to speak in front of people. I don't want to mess up. But when I found that it was actually the root of criticism, I was able to deconstruct it and rewire. So number one, you've got to face your fear. The longer that you wait, the more powerful it's going to become over you. If you continue to wait, you'll never conquer it. The second big thing is there's an individual, BJ Fogg, and he's got an incredible model. I think for myself personally, in my opinion, it's probably the easiest model to change habits in your life. And just like you were saying, Whitney, if you have the fear of spiders, you're not just going to throw somebody into a pit of spiders. Of course not. If you want long-term results, you start with baby steps. You create triggers. Back to the reticular activating system, you identify visual, auditory, or touch triggers. And then you use those in your life. For example, if you want to change your diet and you have a coffee maker and you have coffee and a donut every morning, you can start by simply putting an apple next to the coffee maker. And every time you see that apple, now you're going to auditorially be triggered to say, oh, I remember that I'm on this pursuit of health. And then you start to change the donut with the apple and so forth. So again, I think primarily you have to face the fear. You've got to get to the root. You have to take it head on, just like you said, with courage. And then the second one is being very critical about baby steps. You don't want to, you can cold turkey 100%. However, oftentimes what happens is people will have a spike of emotional experience or response, and they'll go back to that habit. So if you really want to change the habit and have a long lasting change, you've got to have these baby steps, and then you grow on it. And maybe that takes you a couple days, maybe weeks, maybe months, but then you take that. The average person takes 66 days to create or change a habit. So you can replace one habit with another. If you have the fear of overpasses, and I'm sure that you have the solution based on that conversation with your client, but you've got to take baby steps. And it's got to start. You're not just going to run through the overpass and just do that every day. You've got to slowly implement these ways to transition out. I think another thing that's really fascinating about courage is that, again, if we go back to the fear of death, and this is something that Freud was really passionate about. I'm a little bit conflicted on this perspective, but essentially throughout time, the big element of courage and bravery came from people putting their life in line that could be taken. and they would be viewed as, oh, that's very courageous. Oh, that's very brave. But just like you said, I think that there are small wins of courageous acts that go unnoticed. So reflection is really, really powerful here. When we talk about reflection, there's usually a negative connotation with it, at least in my perspective. And that comes from the root of being a child, doing something inappropriate, and being told, go sit and think about what you've done. That was negative reflection. But you can flip the script and have positive reflection. And let's say it's an accolade at work, or you do something really well in your life. You got to sit and look at that, track it, write it down, take 5 minutes to reflect and say, wow, this went really well. I need to do this again. So to recap, I think number one, you've got to face the fear. You've got to get to the root. Number two, you've got to implement small baby steps. And number three, you have to track or reflect on those wins as you progress forward.
Wow, that's amazing. I love it. I'm so excited by all of this conversation. So something that you mentioned about when you do make a decision to change your habit, a lot of times there will be an emotional reaction, an emotional trigger that will make you want to go back to the old way. And one of the things that I find really closely related to this whole idea, and a lot of people have a vice, whether it's alcohol, so they get emotional, they get stressed, they go get a glass of wine or a bottle of vodka or whatever, or they have this emotional trigger and they eat. A lot of people don't even realize that they're emotional eating. If you're sitting on the couch eating chips and then you're eating something else and you're just constantly eating, it might be time to figure out what's going on emotionally, what's going on within you. And so a lot of these emotional triggers, they're confounded because people don't understand their worthiness. And this goes back to what you said also about kids being put in timeout and said, you've been bad. You need to think about what you've done. And when a child hears, well, I'm bad, I'm a bad person, and we go through a lot of different experiences like this. Maybe it was you blame yourself for losing a loved one or for a divorce that happened, or your parents always made you feel unworthy. There's this worthiness that, well, other people deserve to be happy, but I'm okay. I'll just settle for less. Other people deserve to have great bodies and be healthy, but I'm just not that person. I'm just fat. I've always been fat and I'm always will be fat, or, and sometimes people can, weight doesn't always prove health. There can be skinny, unhealthy people and people that are technically overweight that are healthy, but it's all about how you feel and what's going on in your body. But it comes down to this idea that a lot of people just don't feel like they're worthy. And this is another thing, like you said, you didn't recognize as a kid what the fear was. You just recognized what was going on. A lot of people have no idea that they have this lack of worthiness. And I have to pull this out of people. And finally they're like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I never thought about it. But if you're not prioritizing your own self and your own self-care, and you're worried about everybody else, you probably have an issue with not feeling worthy. If you are constantly in toxic relationships or bad relationships with people, or bad situations at work where you're overworked and stressed out and mistreated, you probably have a struggle with worthiness. And this is really important. It's foundational. We need this for everything in life. We need to feel worthy of living in order to face our fears, in order to push ourselves beyond, in order to have compassion for ourselves. So curious if you have anything to add around that those feelings of worthiness or unworthiness.
I 100% agree with you. I think that worthiness is a very big foundational part of our lives. So oftentimes what I find in myself and working with people is that when we have a lack of self-worth, it usually comes down to two things. They don't know their why, and they're not intentional. When you know exactly why you're doing things and what the big picture is, it allows you to be intentional. When you're intentional about what you do, you never compare yourself to other people or other results. You focus on your steps in getting there. I really like to call this the oxygen mask theory on one of the things that you said. So the oxygen mask theory is when you get onto a plane and they're going through the regulations and rules, if anything were to happen on the plane, one of the things they tell you is if the oxygen mask deploys, you have to put it on yourself first, because if you don't, you can't help other people. And I saw a poll on this the other day on Facebook, and essentially there was a mother and she said, who do you categorize first? Your spouse, your child, or yourself? The most common answer that I saw was your children, then your spouse, then yourself. And the bottom two may have varied. But what I contested is that, look, if you don't focus on making yourself better, you're not going to give the people that need you the best version of you. And then you always hear all these excuses. Well, yeah, but you don't understand. How am I supposed to work out when I've got to feed kids in the morning and do this and that? It's simple. You get up before they wake up and you start your exercise. That doesn't mean you have to spend 10 hours. You can spend 30 minutes and get a sound exercise in. But it's about prioritizing yourself, not to be selfish. It's actually selfless. You prioritize yourself so you can give the best to the people that need it and love you. And I think that's such an important part. You also had mentioned things about addiction and changing. If you have a habit that doesn't serve you, you need to replace it with something else. For instance, when you understand your core values, then you can understand how to really implement this. And here's what I mean. I have a friend that said, my core values have changed over life. I used to love partying and getting drunk, and now I love spending that time with my family. So I no longer have the same value. And I contested with him, you have the same value. It's just the application that's changed. So what I mean is that the relationships, that was the core value. So if you look at relationships and say, okay, well, I get the value because I'm spending that time with like-minded people, with peers, and we're drinking or whatever that looks like, you can replace that with changing where that time is devoted, spending it with loved ones, children, your family members, whoever that is. So I think that, again, it always comes back to the root. But when we talk about self-worthiness, you got to understand that you're absolutely a miracle. That's undeniable. I think that there's a Buddhist proverb that expresses this the best, that I'm in love with. And it's very simple. Let's say that you could imagine in your head right now the closest ocean to you. And let's say you were to go jump into that ocean. And then on the opposite side of the world, a sea turtle with a big red dot on its back would jump into the ocean as well. And somewhere in the middle, you were to throw a life preserver out. The chance of the turtle finding the life preserver, coming up and poking his head out on the very first try before you ever found it, those are the odds of you being born the way that you are. It's about 600 trillion. Wow. The chance that you would be exactly who you are. So you have to understand that there is a beautiful uniqueness to who you are already. It just takes some self-development and self-worth. And that always comes back to why. Why are you doing this? What is your greater purpose? How do you serve other people? So it's just all interconnected together. And when people can open up and see that, then you can really change your life and you can impact other people. And what a better way. What else are we here for than to spread love?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And just by being born, you are worthy. I'll say that again. Just by being born, you are worthy. No matter what sort of childhood you had, no matter what people told you, no matter what mistakes you've made in life, we're all human. We've all made mistakes. We all have things that we wish we could have done differently. But it's all about doing what you can with what you have, where you are, and moving forward and making decisions, being intentional. And I love you said this before, that not making a decision is a decision. if you have these bad habits and you're like, well, I'll get to it later, I'll get to it later, I'm not sure what to do, I don't know what habit I could replace this with, whatever it is, if you're just putting off making a decision, that is your decision. You're choosing not to address it, you're choosing to ignore it. So I want to encourage everybody to look at their life and start making some decisions. And when it comes to sticking to that routine, and I know you said it takes 66 days, I've heard anything from 28 days. So let's say a month or 2 months. If you can create a new routine, it takes commitment. And in order to have commitment, it takes knowing what your purpose is, knowing the why. If you're just saying, well, I'm going to eat green apples instead of red apples from now on, and it could be really hard to keep that commitment if you're like, well, why am I doing this? Right. But when you have a purpose and a reason, it keeps that commitment. You can keep making that decision again and again and again. If it's, I am going to start prioritizing my workouts and my health and myself because I love my children, because I want to live a long life with them, because I want to see my grandchildren eventually, that can become your purpose. And instead of saying, well, working out is selfish and I'm taking time away from my family, or I just don't want to get up in the morning, I'm just not a morning person. I used to say that. I used to say, I'm just not a morning person. And now I wake up and the first thing I do usually is work out. And I'm like, wow, I never thought that this would be me. So whatever you think you are as a person, also, like, you don't have to be that. You can change. And it just takes making a decision, understanding your why, and then having commitment to stick to it long enough to make it your new habit. And then you are that person.
Absolutely. Raise your standard and attach the actions with the identity, not the results, but the actions. And then John C. Maxwell said this really well. He said, there are two types of people: the people that do things when they feel like it, and the people that do things because they want to feel good. So how you do one thing is usually how you do all things. But I know we're getting close to time. I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah. Well, Coach Keeg, what a pleasure to have you on. You are so wise and such an awesome coach. How can people find you?
Well, Whitney, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure. I always enjoy our talks. Feel free to email me. I'm in a rebranding phase right now, so the new website will be out very soon. I'm so excited about it. But the email is Coach Keeg, so CoachKeeg @gmail.com. And I would love to hear from people.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keegan. And of course, you can reach me through my website, hearthunterslovecoaching.com. You offer a free session, right? To get to know someone, to see what their needs are, to help them out.
Yeah, absolutely. I always offer at least 2 free sessions to see if people are compatible and answer any questions, and always bring value first.
Okay. Awesome. So take him up on that. Get a couple of free sessions. What do you have to lose? I offer the same. I only coach women. So if you're a guy, reach out to Coach Keeg. If you're a woman looking for more fulfillment, more love, I would be happy to have a free session, sit down with you and see how we might be able to help you out. So to everyone, good luck evolving yourself. The journey within never stops. We're never fully there. It's ongoing. And the best to everyone. Thank you, Keeg.
Thank you so much. Have an incredible day. That was awesome.